Hello, everybody, and welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. I have with me today Ben Watson, and we're going to talk about Catholic and stuff, which basically means Ben's a Catholic and I'm a Protestant, and we talk about that a lot and a lot of other things that we have no idea where this is going to go, and so we're just going to go. So, Ben, could you tell everybody a little bit about who you are, and then we'll figure out where to go after that?
There we go. So my name is Ben, and I'm a Catholic. It's not really, I don't know. It's sort of an interesting question about in what order that comes in the hierarchy of the way I identify myself. But I'm also an architect. I do carpentry part of the time. I teach up at KSU part of the time as well. And I'm pretty active in the Catholic community in and around Atlanta. And I have been Catholic my whole life. So I don't know. I guess that's a way to kind of summarize things. I mean, I'm still. I could say I'm still in the. I don't know, early life. I feel like, and so it's interesting when you. I don't know, maybe balancing out Catholicism in early life, especially in terms of some of the other Catholics that I talk to and know that are in their 70s, and have been thinking and living with. I don't know. I'm gonna say the faith life for decades. But yeah, I will say I'll give a little background in terms of maybe sort of how I am still Catholic now, in light of I'd say the many things that I've learned about Catholicism and just the way I've lived life. And so I should say I am a cradle Catholic. I don't know what the Protestant equivalent is. That means that I've been Catholic since I was basically born. In Catholic world, normally you're baptized fairly soon after you're born. In the Catholic world, that sacrament is one of the only sacraments that I'd say your parents can sort of offer to you without you necessarily being in control of it, or without you necessarily accepting it. It's looking to sort of bring you into, I would say, the inheritance of the kingdom of God ultimately, and actually sort of bestowing upon you a grace from God as a part of baptism. It's one of the 7 sacraments of the church. I would say that I really didn't care too much about it at all, really, until I was maybe about 17 years old. Growing up, my parents would go to Mass every Sunday. My mother was especially active in the Catholic community that I was a part of. She actually did something for about 20 years when I was growing up. There was a group of women at our church that were praying to God for someone to come and build them a prayer garden at the church. And my mother was kind of the response to that. And she showed up there, and after my parents moved back to Nashville, and they joined that community, and she ended up being the person that built what is called the prayer garden at St. Stephen's Catholic Community. And every Wednesday growing up, I was there, sometimes helping, sometimes goofing around in piles of dirt and stuff. And it was interesting, though, because I think ultimately thinking back on it, that's one of the things that showed, I think, my mother's commitment to her faith. And my father was there most of the time as well. He worked more than my mother did. But that was, I'd say, how my parents, I guess, lived out the example of their faith life to me. And then when I was 17, I went to Catholic school, essentially K through 12. And when I was in high school, I was at a place called Father Ryan High School in Nashville. I had a course on British literature when I was 17. And for whatever reason, reading British literature and reading especially many older books. I mean, Shakespeare is part of that and other things, but we'd read C.S. Lewis and things by Master Anonymous, like The Green Knight or Beowulf, or many these other works. And for whatever reason, that sort of awoke in me almost like the knowledge of a moral imperative in the universe. And I went from not really caring about my faith at all to being extremely concerned about those things. And I went from not reading anything at all to reading everything. And that fire burned, I'd say, consistently until I was actually part of the way through college. When architecture, or at least my architectural degree, started taking over my life a lot more. The other interesting thing that I would say that's sort of part of my faith life, I don't think I've necessarily ever been in a place or a situation where I could not be a part of a faith community in a serious way. So when I was in high school, I was a part of, a Catholic community. It was a high school. I was also part of a group called Life Teen at my main church, where my parents were members. When I got to college at UT, there was a pretty serious Catholic community there. On campus, it was a fully functioning parish, which was interesting because even though they would cater predominantly to college students, they would actually cater to families of all ages and sizes. So we'd have married couples in there that were like 90 years old, or we'd have young families with a bunch of kids there on every Sunday. And as a result, it ended up being a super interesting, I'd say, I don't know, pivot point for me at UT. I got to know the priests there really well. The Paulist fathers ran that place. And it was kind of a go-to spot. Like I could show up there on Friday nights at midnight, and Father Charlie would be hanging out, and I would have like spiritual concerns, and he'd be willing to sit there and talk to me for like an hour or two. And that was like on a regular basis. So that was kind of a wonderful thing to have through college. And I still actually go back there whenever I visit Knoxville. And then in Atlanta, it's been interesting because I've sort of bounced around different Catholic communities, but Atlanta actually has some extremely strong young Catholic groups that are very active around the community. And so I've been bouncing around those probably for the last 4 or 5 years since I've really come to Atlanta. So I'd say that's kind of an interesting thing, at least sort of about my formation as a Catholic. And then I've got sort of Catholic mentors and things that I talk to all the time.
I mean, honestly, that doesn't sound a whole lot different than a lot of Protestants' upbringing. I mean,
yeah,
sure, there's going to be some different theology, and there's going to be, but the practices, while there's different theology behind them, a lot of them aren't going to be a whole lot different, especially as you're growing up as a kid. It's going to be pretty similar in the baptism and the youth groups and so forth.
Well, the interesting thing is, I don't know, and I've had friends of different walks of life, both, I'd say, come into the church. Like I've experienced people convert into Catholicism. I've experienced people leave the church. I really, to be honest, don't know many that left the church, I'm going to say, for a Protestant faith. Most of the people I know that have left into nothing. That's a more common experience. But I will say, I don't know if I know anyone. Oh, I don't know. It's going to come out a certain way. I don't know anyone that's super or seriously engaged with their faith that left it into nothing. That's been a different kind of challenge. That most of the people that I know that left the church, because it was interesting when I got to college and I told them that I came from Father Reinrich. Oh, you're one of those, and it came to find out that meant, oh, you're probably not going to remain Catholic. And I was like, that's great. But honestly, I think it came down to kind of an engagement thing. I think that a lot of people don't encounter the extremely intense intellectual tradition of the church, and then they get to college and they're like challenged by all these different ideas and philosophies and just different people of various dispositions, and they're like, well, I don't want to remain Catholic, or they just want to do certain things like have a bunch of sex or go party all the time or whatever. And they just don't engage with their faith life very much.
So you think it's for most people who's leaving, you're suggesting that it's not because they got into it and discovered, okay, this thing is empty. It's more of they never really saw the value, other things drew them, and that sort of, like their focus was elsewhere. And
they
sort of drifted away.
Well, it's one of those things that you have to, I'd say that in order to ultimately, maybe like this, maybe ultimately to remain a Christian or Catholic, for that matter, you have to, I'd say, have a very vigorous. You have to have a difficult encounter with it in a way. Like you have to have an encounter with it where it actually challenges you. I don't think if it doesn't challenge you, I don't think people really see the value in it. Like, and so when I was 17, encountering the moral imperative that I discovered, like in the world and in Catholicism, it's like, no, it demands things of you. And that's something to actually contend with. It's kind of like God demanding things of you. Like, I don't know. We were talking about the 10 Commandments a little while ago. Like that's a demand. And like, even like, Christ coming and giving out things of like, give up all you have and take up your cross and follow me. That's a demand. And unless you're willing to do that, unless you're really willing to engage with that, it's kind of like, it's not that I just don't care that much part of the time. It's like, yeah, you're going to go off and do your own thing and maybe find that it's ultimately very unsatisfying, but then you're like, oh, I'm gonna be cool. I'm gonna go be like a prosperity Christian and just kind of hang out and do this. And like, no. You have to experience the cross of Christianity. It's crazy. I was reading about, there's a guy named Origen of Alexandria.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of the. There's not many people that granted, I'm hearing all this all like second or 12th hand, really, about men that knew the Bible. I didn't realize that. I mean, at the time, there were so many martyrs as a part of Christianity, and he himself was technically martyred from the injuries he suffered from being tortured to death. He sort of actively encouraged his father to not necessarily go be a martyr, but go be a witness for the Christian faith, and as a result, become a martyr. And it was interesting because apparently he was like calming his dad down. He's like, look, if you do this, like Mom and I will be okay. So that was like involved in his life from the get-go. But that was like showing him as almost like an 8-year-old, like young kid being super engaged with this, like rising to like the challenge of Christianity.
Yeah, see, the thing is, like, what I see in Protestant circles right now is that a lot of people, or like some portion of people, some small percentage of people, are really engaging with their faith, and it's the ones who are really engaging with it that are leaving.
Really?
And it's not the super engaged people are staying in church. It's the super engaged people are leaving just because they find what exists in church to be empty. I mean, think of all the problems that you've been seeing, like with evangelicalism and things in the last number of years. It's just where it's just, it's a social club, and it's not. It's if you're looking for that serious thing, if you're an Origin of Alexandria, and you go to a church that's basically, it exists to hang out, and that's about it, then it's like Origin's either going to, flip over tables, or he's going to leave. Like he's not going to hang out and just enjoy the party. And that's what I've been seeing a lot of Protestant churches in the last number of years. It's been increasing, I think, with time. I don't have statistics. It's just anecdotal from people that I've talked to. And
I mean, there are more people leaving the churches. I think like for every one person that becomes Catholic, 6 leave right now.
Do you not see this, or do you not see the similar sort of thing? Like people get really, really serious are leaving, or maybe there's a difference because I guess in the whole Protestant tradition, it's like if you're serious about it, then you're going to pursue it regardless of what everybody else around you is doing, because we're not necessarily tied into that tradition in the same way that you are. And so, I mean, we're kind of sort of founded on, if something's wrong, then you just do it the right way. And if people don't accept you around you, then you just go somewhere else and do it. And
that definitely happens in Catholicism. There was, who was it? Not St. Francis. One of the recent popes basically was one of the reasons he became, I think, a saint ultimately, is he walked in on a bishop having an affair with somebody. And he's like, is nothing sacred? They got mad. He didn't leave the church though. Which is, there was a book that Bishop Barron wrote about the recent sex abuse scandal taking place in the Catholic Church, and one of the big chapters is like, you really shouldn't be leaving. And if you read church history, you would know this is not the first time. But back to your question though, I don't find people that become seriously engaged with Catholicism to be leaving. At least I don't know of any doing that. Maybe they ultimately go find a different Catholic church because the community they're a part of does not, I will say, cater to the spiritual nuances of their life. For example, if you go to Mass on Sundays, it's in English pretty much everywhere, except for, I'm going to say, some Hispanic communities where there's also, a lot of Hispanic Masses. Those are at the Basilica, Christ the King. There's one at Holy Spirit. They're offered in most places because there's a very, very large Hispanic population in most places in the South. But you can also find very conservative Catholic churches where Mass is still basically done in Latin. Before Vatican II, in the latter half of the 20th century, all Mass was in Latin, essentially. And it was interesting because all the music in Mass and everything was originally written for Latin. So all that's still there. And it was only after Vatican II where they said Mass can now be in English, and they had to sort of retranslate everything. Actually, only 10 years ago, they had a couple other translation clarifications in the Mass, and it messed everybody up in terms of like, the responses and stuff like that throughout Mass. You could tell who was like the people that only showed up at Christmas and Easter because they didn't know the new responses.
Because they get used to doing the one thing all the time, and that's what you're like when you have those like response things that you do. It's like you only know the one way, and I've definitely like I grew up in the United Methodist Church, and then I've been to others before, and sometimes we'll do something just a little bit differently, or we'll have a different tune set to the same words, and it just messes with your mind. It's like that's not right. I get that.
It's interesting though because and so maybe I should clarify what I mean by spiritual engagement. Or engagement with the faith in Catholicism. Because normally what happens, it's not exclusively an intellectual engagement when people, I'd say, up their intensity. Most of the time, what you're doing, some of the things I've seen, so Mass is offered daily in almost every church, actually. It's not just a Sunday thing. You can go to daily Mass if you like. And that's a different kind of thing because I'd say, hold the sacrament of the Eucharist at daily Mass to be a very different kind of thing that I'd say Protestant churches do. I'm not sure about everyone sort of independently, or even some of the Eastern Orthodox things. I think Eastern Orthodox still hold the Eucharist in the same way. So that's one thing. And most times when people become super engaged with their faith, they're not just becoming engaged with the intellectual component, they're becoming engaged with the almost mystical components of the church. So I'd say they're receiving the sacraments more, which means they're going to daily Mass more. They're going to go to confession more. The one thing you can do is that the Eucharist sometimes is actually placed in something called a monstrance, and it is left out on the altar for something called adoration. And it's because Roman Catholics believe that the Eucharist is, I'm not going to say literally, but they believe that it is the body and blood of Christ, that you are adoring Christ in the presence of Christ in the church, in the monstrance. And so there are things in the church. It's like a more spiritual, mystical experience. They'll have 24 hours of adoration, where people will actually sign up because someone has to sort of continuously be there in the presence of Christ, on the altar. And then after the 24 hours, the priest will actually come and remove the monstrance and place the Eucharist back in the tabernacle behind the altar.
So what you've said mystical a couple of times. What do you mean when you say mystical? Because I think when non-Catholics hear that, we think like wizards, and pretty sure you don't mean wizards. Though if you can learn how to become a wizard, I'm signing up.
Didn't you know that if you become Catholic, you can teleport?
Well, that's it. I'm becoming Catholic. Like we're ending this, and I'm going to go become Catholic right now because that seems totally worth it.
There are some saints that have some interesting, bonkers, miraculous recordings of something called bilocation, where somehow they'll be like physically present in one space, but seen somewhere totally different. And everybody's like, what's going on? It's weird stuff. Padre Pio was a famous one from the early 20th century that could do that. But anyways, mystical, I'm kind of using as an in-between word. How do you suggest a religious spiritual experience to somebody? Like what do you call that state of mind? When you're there in the presence of Christ and you're sort of losing yourself in it.
I mean, that seems like as good a word as any, but
so
I mean, certain experiences just in general, even if you just step out of the religious world, some experiences are really, really hard to communicate to people.
Yes.
Like you just sort of can't. It's like, well, you just kind of have to do it. You have to be there, and there's no other really way for it to make sense.
So as a part of I'd say the structure of a Catholic life, and it's something that I think a lot of Catholics honestly just mess up on, and most Christians in general, it is this prayer life, like this intentionally spending time with God, like independent of anything else on a daily basis. That's why a lot of I'd say the orders are founded after that. Like you go visit the Trappist monks or the Benedictines or the Dominicans or any of those, founded by these famous saints. And there's almost a famous order founded for every major problem in an era. And I'm sort of wondering if there's going to be a new order founded today for today's problems. Where a serious spiritual, almost 2 to 3 hours of their day is spent in prayer, silence. And they're there to intentionally place themselves in the presence of God. It's one of those things that people may try to equate it to meditation. I honestly don't know enough about the difference to tell you if there's a difference. I mean, to pray is to lift the mind and the heart to God intentionally. That's part of the intent of it. And meditation, I think, is sometimes it's almost like you're praying without a direction, maybe, if that makes sense, which is probably a healthy thing, because you're trying to sort of, I don't know, examine yourself in that. And I'd say the intent of Christian prayer is to do that in the presence and with the direct intent of like orienting to God. So I'd say, and the reason I say about all that is that's part of that's part of the serious engagement with the Catholic faith. I'd say that if you're only engaging intellectually, it's going to become very, very difficult for you. Eventually, I hope you probably would find something there. It's kind of like, I know that a lot of people have a hard time with the Catholic teaching on human sexuality. They just find it difficult, which I don't blame them. It is difficult. Talk to any of my married friends that are Catholic. There can be something great there. It's kind of like, I don't know. It's every time God gives a demand on you, and I would say, and I'm saying God gives a demand on you. When the church asks something of you that prayerfully is not unreasonable, I do think a grace can come with that if you almost obediently engage with it. And maybe the obedience thing is a difficult linchpin for a lot of people today.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a little more difficult for Americans in particular, because freedom in America, and like it's all about independence, and we wave our flags on every day, and 4th of July twice. I mean, it's just, so the idea of following somebody else when you don't want to is kind of the opposite of what most of us think of as being an American. And that's an unusual, it's an ahistorical idea of freedom. Like we were talking about earlier, it's like most thinkers in history would not have seen freedom as the ability or the right to do literally anything you want whenever you want. That's a new idea.
It is. And I don't think people, but I mean, it's probably because we're actually free. and then it's like the people with the most freedom probably complain the most about not having freedom, because the people without freedom are probably just trying to survive.
They don't have time.
No, which is, it's kind of a sad thing, but it's
like, why you read ancient histories and stuff, and the word boredom doesn't exist. Like it's just not there.
It's called survival. Jeez.
Right, they didn't have time to be bored. They were busy trying to survive.
I had another point I wanted to make. I'm trying to remember what it is now. And we
were talking about the intellectual.
Do Protestant pastors take vows of any sort?
Vows?
Yeah.
Like what sort of vows? Like, I mean, like priestly vows are kind of like that's a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I could just use priestly vows as an example of that. Most priests take vows of celibacy, obedience, and...
Wait, there's priests who don't take vows of celibacy?
I would actually... So the only reason I say that is... Okay, so priests take vows of celibacy. But it's one of those things where it's celibacy, poverty, and obedience. And not every priest takes... I'd say they all take celibacy, but they don't take the other two necessarily. Yeah, and depending on and if you're in a religious order, technically, I mean, it said they all take vows of celibacy also, but they don't necessarily take the other vows either. Actually, I learned recently that the cloistered monasteries, some of them, I think it might be the Poor Clares, when they take vows of poverty, it's not just of material wealth; it's actually of relationships too. So they have to like break off their earthly relationship kind of thing when they... It's not really break off, but the intent is for them to severely limit them to where they're not really spending time building those. So it's very much like the hermit in the desert, kind of like, I don't know, St. John of the Cross or something like that. Maybe St. Anthony. Is that a permanent thing, or is that just for a while thing? It's a permanent thing, actually. And I know that some of them could only see their family members like once a year. Because on the one hand, it seems like that's
Like I could see that really being really valuable as like a training period or initiation time, like you learn how to focus on the things of God. But on the other hand, it's like we are meant for relationships, and so divorcing yourself from that doesn't seem healthy.
I would say I pretty much agree. That was my protest. But I would also say that very, very few people are built for that. It's one of those things. If you go try to be a poor Claire, they do not let you take full permanent vows for like 7 years. So you have to seriously explore for a while if this is what is meant for you. I actually went on kind of a date with a girl a couple years ago that tried to be a nun. She was there for about 2 years before she discerned that was.
Was it because of your date?
No. This was after. She went from atheist to nun to dating. It was a roller coaster of a life.
That is a roller coaster. She needs to take some time and level out before. Yeah.
So it's one of those. I don't know. The Catholic world is vast. That's what it feels like most of the time. Like I try to describe little parts of it. And it's one of those things where like every time, it's like every time the Catholic Church like tries to say no, God just tends to make the tent bigger, I guess. And then it's interesting because you look at the Pope and what the Pope says, and American Catholics typically think they're the only Catholics, which is not the case.
Because Americans think they're the only people.
Yeah. And so the Pope has to respond to all these other cultures and peoples and things. It's like interesting because like you look at the College of Cardinals, and there's cardinals from every continent, every culture. There probably should not be an American Pope for a while. Like, because the recent ones is like they were all Italian for a long time, and then you had a Polish Pope, which was JP2. Actually, reading the stories of that guy when he was young is amazing. If you want to read something inspiring, like he's the kind of person going into like the war zone and like carrying people out, like in the battlefield kind of guy. Like it's like a bonkers level of commitment. He knew. I think he knew he was a priest, going to become a priest fairly young. And then when I was in Poland, actually, I would tour around a little bit with where he would really engage with young people. Yeah, it was that's probably one of the reasons like Poland has maintained its Catholicism, even though it's going down a very politically conservative route right now. And then after that, the next Pope is one of his best friends, which is Pope Benedict, who's actually a really good Pope. The media doesn't like him very much because he said lots of conservative things, and the media doesn't like conservative things, unless you're Fox News. And then Pope Francis is kind of a wild card. So you go from having all these Italian bishops to having a Polish bishop to having a German bishop to having an Argentinian bishop. We should have an African bishop or an African Pope next. That'd be awesome. Totally different.
Who are the main candidates? What is that going to look like?
There's a guy named Cardinal Sarah, actually, he's kind of a firebrand conservative thing. That would be a radical, interesting direction for the church to take. Especially
after this Pope.
Yeah. Pope Francis has this habit of saying things that are probably a little too ambiguous for most Catholics. And I agree with the criticism. I think he's probably the best parish priest you've ever met, to be honest. That's probably what he is. But the Pope is an interesting position because the Pope is there to honestly clearly represent and articulate the magisterium of the church. Like, you don't want to be ambiguous about things, about teachings when you're the Pope. And Pope Francis just tends to do that. It's like, stop it. Just try and for a minute, just read your catechism and just say that. It's not hard. And most of the magic for the Pope comes in honestly just explaining it. And then the thing is that I love about Pope Francis is just the sheer pastoral gestures he'll make to people. It's kind of like, I would hear stories about JP2 like that, where there was apparently a priest that was sort of washed up in Rome, just on the streets. And the Pope literally goes up to him, and the priest is like, Pope JP2, will you hear my confession? And the Pope said, yes. So the guy confesses, and then the Pope says, now, Father, will you hear my confession? And that was sort of him calling the priest back to the church. So like, no, like, don't be like this. Like, you can keep going. And that's honestly the kind of thing I like to hear from the popes.
We could use a lot more of that sort of an attitude with leaders. Mm-hmm. I'm talking specifically religious leaders, but all of them would be good too.
I think
that's
I
what
think
it
a
is
lot
here.
of the leadership, to be honest, has lost the ability to walk away. Like, you have to be willing to say no to the high rolling donor to the church. You have to be willing to sacrifice like that, because that's ultimately the position that you yourself have gotten in. It's like, I mean, it was literally when Christ sent the disciples out. If they reject you, kick the dust off and leave. Like, you have to be willing to say no. Yeah,
If
and
you're
be poor as a
unwilling to
result.
say, if you're unwilling to say no, then what you're basically doing is saying, I've got this way that things need to work out, and I'm relying on that way instead of relying on God to sort everything out. And so, I mean, that's really sort of basic, like
It is.
following God 101.
But I think people just get confused about, or don't necessarily think about it too hard, because especially in the West, like I've had friends that have gone and been more missionary types in really poor countries, where they're almost desperate, living day by day with the God will provide type of mentality. I've never had to live like that, to be honest. I kind of really wonder what it would be like. But they can say that once they come back to America, it's really affected their spiritual life, because they don't have really want of any material thing. And as a result,
Do they maintain what they've had? Do they
well,
sort
it's
of
just
keep that
hard
same
to.
mindset?
It's hard to when you don't need it all the time. It's kind of like, I don't know. You know the Coptic Christians in the Middle East that
I know who they are, but I don't know loads about
that the
them.
Muslims really don't like because they're not Muslim. Like, it's kind of like I don't know. I never wish that kind of desperation on anybody. But I do wonder what that kind of living situation does to your faith life. Like, we're in an odd place now where I don't feel like we really have to live with hardship. But most of the time, most people have had to live with extreme hardship. And Christianity, I would say, is almost explicitly designed for a world filled with hardship. And when we don't
really, which has been most people's experience for most of history.
And so I wonder, like, if part of the time, like, I don't know, for example, I'm doing this Exodus 90 program. I should probably explain that for people.
Yeah, let's finish your thought and then do Exodus 90, because that's a whole topic.
It is a whole topic. Where was I going with it?
Coptic Christians, suffering, hardship.
I mean, since we just don't have to engage with that kind of suffering and hardship today. Like, I don't think it necessarily forces us to ultimately give up the things of our life to truly engage with Christianity. Like, because Christianity, it's not an intellectual exercise, ultimately. It's part of it. Like, because you're going to be thinking about it and praying about it and wondering about it and trying to getting to know yourself and getting to know God and follow Jesus. But like, it's one of those things that if you don't necessarily have any situation that's going to create a crisis in your life that's going to force you to choose. Like, while a terrible burden and an awful thing, that does force you to choose.
That's also what God uses to shape us.
Right.
In part when we don't want to, or even if we do want to go the right direction, it just ramps it up even more.
It's kind of like the male rites of initiation. The don't try to avoid suffering.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's seriously a part of it, because I think that suffering, it's kind of like, actually JP2 would do that. He's like, people, you'd be suffering, and people are like, dang it, I gotta suffer now. And JP's like, no, don't. That's an opportunity right there. I was like, that's an opportunity.
For those who don't know what's going on, I'm reading a book on male initiation rites, and one of the things that's common among those is that is the idea not to try to avoid suffering, is because it's something that you have to. It's an opportunity for you to learn and grow through. So don't try to escape suffering until you've actually learned and grown the way you need to. So
I would say that Christianity and the topic of Christianity through a framework of suffering is probably, you could spend a lifetime just studying that and living with that, and it would be extremely fruitful. That's not the only thing.
The only way to really. No, sorry, go ahead.
That's not the only thing you need to do, but
right.
I don't know. I think a lot of people today, there's a question like, why would God allow suffering in the world? And really the better question is, like, what do you do about it? Like,
is the better question.
Yeah, I mean, is God with you in that? That's the thing.
I mean, God doesn't seem particularly interested in answering the question, why did he allow it? But even if he did,
what would God's
here's
question be back? How about that? Let's play the Jewish game. You ask God, Why is there suffering in the world? What does God say back?
Well, we have a whole book of the Bible on that, on Job.
Yes, yeah.
And
Were you there at the foundations of the world?
No, even better. It starts with like the single best response in the entire Bible. Like right before he said, were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? He's like, gird up your loins and answer me like a man. It's like, I will ask you and you instruct me. It's like,
it was weird.
Okay.
Growing up hearing gird your loins, the only thing I could think about was pork loin. That's the only type of loin I knew about.
Are we seasoning pork loin? Like, what is
Are we
this?
seasoning our loins?
Will there be pineapple?
Oh my gosh.
Oh, the children's Bible. Oh, yeah.
Anyway, Exodus 90. So, and I kind of wish more. It's interesting when I tell my Catholic friends what I'm doing. So I'm doing a program right now. This is the second year I've done it, called Exodus 90. And what it is a 90-day spiritual retreat that usually ends in the Roman Catholic calendar, Easter. And for 90 days, it's essentially a prolonged Lent, but a lot more things. There's 3 legs to it. There's the leg of fraternity, the leg of prayer, and the leg of asceticism. And it's interesting. I think the moral mind might cringe at the idea of asceticism, but what it is asceticism is essentially, it's like voluntary suffering, giving up things in your life that you need to let go of. And I would say that and it's interesting because you do the program and it gives you sort of a description of each leg. And the asceticism, I would say there's voluntary things you give up and then things you should permanently give up. The voluntary ones are like, you're going to take cold showers for 90 days. You're going to exercise consistently for like, I say minimum like 4 days a week. And it needs to be kind of an intense thing. You're not just like, I'm going to do a couple push-ups and call it a day. No, you're going to get in there and do it. You're going to give up all essentially non-essential internet use, video games, television. It's all gone. You're going to fast 2 days a week. It's on Wednesdays and Fridays. And fasting in the Roman Catholic world is no meat, so you can eat fish. But your calorie count is essentially supposed to be less than 2 meals a day. So the way I do it is I normally look at how much I eat, and then I subtract. I take out one meal and kind of take the other meal and I divide that in like half between the other two. It's enough to the point. The idea is that you're fasting to the point you're actually sort of feeling it, sensing it. The practices that you're permanently giving up, if you've got like problems with pornography or something like that, you're definitely giving that up. You're trying to give up extremely sinful habits as well. It's one of those things that you have to, like, some people start out this program really gung ho and then it kind of gets difficult along the way. But anyways, the other 2 legs. The prayer leg is interesting. What you're doing is you're giving a full holy hour to God every day. And a holy hour, you can kind of structure it in many ways. Either with spiritual reading, or you can go to do adoration at church. The core component, though, is that as a part of this holy hour, you need to arrive in a place where you can give about 20 minutes of sort of silent contemplation to God. And the challenge is for you to actually be able to silence your own mind for a bit. That's a difficult thing. That takes practice. And then the third leg is a fraternity. You're not supposed to do this exercise alone. What you're supposed to do is you are going to enter into this with, like, maybe, let's say 8-10 other guys max. And as a part of that, they support you through this endeavor. You okay, Matt? Oh, your video froze. That's what it is.
Yeah, just keep going.
I was like, Matt's falling asleep. No. So it's long. It's 90 days, which is tough. And the point of this exercise, though, is to help you seriously build new habits of life. Especially, I'm going to say, the extreme spiritual habits that you need to honestly live effectively. It's called Exodus 90 because it's essentially modeled after the Israelite Exodus experience, where they're starting out in Egypt, ultimately leaving Egypt through the agency of God, and then working their way towards the Promised Land. And you're reading a chunk out of Exodus every day, and you're essentially contemplating that piece of Exodus every day. There's a whole little guide thing with it. And to be honest, it's probably one of the most spiritually fruitful things I've ever done in my life. I mean, when I was younger, okay, weird question. Protestants do retreats, right?
Yes.
Yes,
they do. We don't do advances.
Advances.
So we only retreat. So my big complaint with that, like those we do, but they really bother me because as you go, you have a nice little spiritual experience for a couple of days, you come back and absolutely nothing about your life has changed.
That's not how you're supposed to retreat, though.
I understand that, which is why it bugs me. It's like
Although I will say, everyone does need to go on retreat because it's also a chance to stop, think about what you're doing, which everybody needs at some point.
So honestly, I don't like the way things are done. I'm sure they can be done better, but that's why I was so interested in your Exodus 90 program, because that sounds, everything you've described, that is the things you're thinking about and being challenged by, as you're going through it, sounds really, really good. I like it.
Challenging that's what it should be. It's 90 days. You don't get away from it. That's the crazy thing about it.
Now you can grit your teeth for a week, but 90 days, that's a lot.
That's long enough. You run out of steam. There's been several moments, I will say personally, on this 90 days where I'm like, I just don't have the endurance for this. And that's what the holy hour is for. You go into the holy hour and you have to bring that to God. That's the intent of it. It's structured in a way that where you run out of steam and the holy hour is there for you to re-engage. I would say, honestly, if you're not doing the holy hour with it, you also give up alcohol as a part of this. That's a big deal too. You're giving up all the viceful things, I guess, and some that are not viceful. I'd say the prayer life is probably the most essential thing there. Most people like to neglect in fraternity, honestly, which is kind of a sad thing, because you have an anchor, a specific guy in the group that you talk to every day about how you're doing, because it's one of the things that when you're tempted to do something, you really need some way to fall back, and not do those things you're tempted to do, especially if you've got a lot of problems in your life. Honestly, I would recommend this program to any guy, I'd say, suffering from dealing with pornography or other major vices in their life. Because
is it something you can do as a Protestant? Is it something that you can just decide to get a group together and do? So for anybody who's watching this, what I'm asking on their behalf is there a book that they can get, a half a dozen guys can get together and go through, or is it?
So it's actually an app. Looks like this. And so you got different things on here about tracking it. I will say everything's extremely applicable to every Christian walk of life, except for the part about these sacramentals involved with the app. There's part of the things where you're supposed to make several confessions to a priest as part of the sacrament of confession in Catholicism as a part of your Exodus experience. And then there's other times where there's explicit discussions about the Rosary, which are very Catholic. I'll put it this way. I don't think anyone would have any issues with a modified Exodus 90 for a Protestant group of men. I will say this is designed as a kind of male experience. I'm pretty sure there are women out there trying to do something very similar. I just don't know what the experience is because I haven't looked. Because I've known some women over in the Catholic communities there that heard what we were doing. They're like, we want to do something too. It's okay, well, go for it. But I will say, if you do it, make sure you have a men's group do it with you. It is not a good idea to do it by yourself. It's explicitly designed for not that way, honestly.
Do you, 2 questions. Do you need a clear leader for this, or can you do it just sort of as a group all trying to do it together? And 2, do you need someone who's been through it? Do what? I
would have a leader.
Okay, you need a leader. And do you need someone who's been through it before?
You do not need someone that's been through it before. That's a part of the thing that the app does is it sort of explains everything. So if you have a group of guys that are going to do it, what you do is you need to meet a little bit before. You have a start date. There's lots of interesting things of this. You meet before a start date because you talk about, all right, how are we going to execute this? You do need to have a leader in the group that can organize the group. It's important. And the leader's role is it's functionary. Okay, where's the meeting going to, you have weekly fraternity meetings. Where's the meeting going to be? When's it going to be? You're there to talk to all the guys and make sure everybody's kind of, participating a little bit. You also have, you tend to sort of rotate group meeting leaders in terms of who's leading the discussion, who's leading the prayers in and out of the meeting. It's not necessarily military, but you need a leader. It helps even more to actually have, I'm going to say, and I've never done this, even though I wanted to do it. I would love to have a priest as a part of it. But part of it is like, if say the Roman Catholic world, the having a priest in there would be nice, because we frequently encounter questions and other sort of spiritual considerations that we would love to have a priest around just to talk to ask that question, because in Exodus, honestly, like, you're turning over stones in your own life. Like, you go spend an hour by yourself a day and you're not used to that, you might freak out. Like, you might look at your life and be like, I'm doing a lot of things I should not be doing. And you need a system around you that's going to be able to support you through that.
So preferably, like, you need to have somebody there, from what I'm hearing you say, not just someone who can organize the meetings and stuff, but you need to have somebody who's a sort of spiritual elder.
Yeah.
If you will, somebody who can help guide you through this, like, as you uncover, different parts of your life, and you find skeletons that you maybe didn't know were there, didn't know were that serious, or now you're finally dealing with, or stuff like that.
Yep. And I would say, like, the thing is, we've never ultimately, that's a recommendation that I have for the Exodus 90 experience. We have never ultimately, the last 2 times, I've done it twice now, this year and the past year, had that spiritual elder in the group. We have a lot of guys that are honestly pretty mature in their faith at this point in the group, that just know a lot. But most of us have spiritual directors in our lives that are either priests or other, I'd say, really qualified Catholic people in the Catholic world, that we kind of go, I'd say, confide and discuss these things with as we encounter them. It's kind of like, it's one of those things that's like, you go to confession and you confess something super duper serious, like, I murdered somebody, and like, your penance might be to go, like, you need to deal with this, you need to go turn yourself in, like, but you need to walk through that, you need to walk through the consequences of that, especially if you discover that skeleton in your closet. Because it's an interesting moment when you do something in your life and you don't really think about it very hard, but you actually think about it much later and realize it was very wrong to do that. You could have the opposite experience. It's interesting, where you do something and you actually figure out it's very good later on. You could have both. But these realizations sometimes come with time.
I would imagine that the things that tend to present us to themselves to us first are the ones that hold us back or hurt us.
Yeah.
Rather than the things that we find that are good that maybe we didn't realize, and it's like a shifting of focus. And I was reading something today in that book on male initiation that we were talking about before, and it said the first half of your life is learning self-control. The second half is learning to give up control. The first half you fight the devil, and the second half you fight God.
That's interesting.
That was an interesting way of putting it. And I'm like, yeah, that does actually make a lot of sense. Like, you have to deal with a lot of the basic stuff first. Learn, basic boundaries in your life, basic things, don't go here, don't do this, don't, almost like you teach children, no. Mm-hmm. And then you can't start sort of opening it up and having you can't have freedom to create until you learn how to, do the basics. So you can't create and freely do something and do it well until you know how the basic stuff. So it always starts with the self-control and discipline, but then you have to, at least in Christian life, you have to give that up and learn how to start following God. And that's hard.
It is hard. There's a lot bound up into that. That takes time. I also don't think we're supposed to experience that all at once. It's like a Peter moment.
No.
Like, Christ saying, that's enough for now. Like, you'll get there. And Peter's like,
because he would always be like, yeah, I want to do it all now.
He sinks into the ocean. So
yeah,
Peter's always getting one step ahead of himself. I didn't realize the first. Well, I think this is true. I think the first recorded miracle actually is recorded by Peter in the Acts, of him and another one.
Post resurrection.
Yes, post resurrection. Of him and another apostle were walking into the temple and something like that, and there was a guy just hanging out, like a lame guy, couldn't walk, and Peter's just like, get up, and everybody's like, that's amazing, and Peter's like, no, it's not. Get over it. Then they go do their thing. The
guy was like, money? He's like, no, better.
Walk. It'd be kind of an intense thing.
Yeah.
Anyways, I recommend Exodus 90 to everybody.
After this, will you send me a link or something that people will find it? I'll put it in the description. And
I will give a heads up. It comes from a fairly conservative Catholic community out of Steubenville, I believe, but I think their program is very applicable to any.
So the program's really good, even if you don't believe with everything that the people on there are.
Yeah.
Saying.
Okay. It's like the three things are essential. It's kind of like if you were to go examine the life of the apostles, right? What are they doing? They're traveling with Jesus. They're praying. They're in fraternity. And they're engaging with, I'm going to say, the various disciplines that Christ is asking of them.
So, yeah, pretty much.
Like that's the model for a spiritual life. Yeah. And there's very much I don't know, probably a belief embedded in there that nothing you can really gain that's of value can you gain without some sort of sacrifice.
Well, and you don't really appreciate anything that comes easily because then it's cheap.
Yeah.
Even though you don't like necessarily working really hard for something at the time that you're doing it, if you do like it, then you're only working probably a little bit hard, not really hard. And you don't like things that are painful, but when you look backwards in your life, you like, okay, those are the things that you appreciate the most. So, and that's one of the things that I liked about, the program you're talking about, is because it is so intense and there's so much, and it's not for a weekend or a week.
It's a lot. It was a lot last year. It's a lot this year. I had an interesting moment, actually. I didn't have it quite this year, but last year, about 2 weeks in, it's like something internally inside me leapt for joy as a part of this program. Mm-hmm. Something I was also my soul was thankful for me doing this. I was like, okay, I'm gonna keep going with this. I've been trying not to fall off the horse too many times. Interesting thing, if anyone does engage with this, I'd say, and one's a very Catholic thing, and the other is a general thing. The habit of exercising consistently will make this much, much easier to do.
Why is that?
It's because you've built a habit of something that's already kind of difficult to do. Yeah, and it means that you're willing to, if you work out in the gym 3-4 days a week, that means you've already all right, I'm going to deny the opportunity to go do other things, watch movies, play video games, drink, whatever. I'm going to go to the gym. And giving yourself that time, it shows you're already willing to deny yourself. And when this program asks you to deny yourself, like, no, you're not going to watch any TV. You're not going to play any video games. You're not going to go out and drink at all in the bars. You're going to pray. And you're going to exercise. And you're going to give this time to God. I find a lot of the guys that have a hard time staying the way or have difficulty exercising consistently. The other part of this, which it's a different discipline, and this is a very Catholic one, is the daily rosary is another, I'd say, consistent habit. Helps a lot of men complete the Exodus. Because
explain what that means.
So most of the time in Roman Catholic world, so a rosary, you've probably seen a rosary. It's got 50. It's got 50 Hail Mary, actually 53 Hail Mary beads on it, a bunch of Our Father beads and things in between. Cross at the end of it, or crucifix. The rosary is looked at as kind of a daily habit of spiritual meditation. When you pray the rosary, normally what you do is you are actively praying over a set of mysteries that are found in the Gospels. So, for example, it's currently Lent, and on Sundays in Lent, you contemplate the sorrowful mysteries. And the first sorrowful mystery is the agony in the garden, and the second one is the scourging at the pillar. The third one's the carrying of the cross, the third one's the crowning of thorns. The fourth one is the carrying of the cross, and the fifth is the death of Christ. And what you're doing as you pray through the rosary is you're using the Hail Marys as almost markers, as a contemplation time for this mystery. And you're also saying the Hail Marys as a way, the prayer is literally, Mary, pray for us as we contemplate these things so that we might get to know your Son better.
So the focus really isn't, so when you're saying a Hail Mary, you're not saying, Mary, you're awesome and cool. It's it's a help us know your son Christ better, and then it's like a guided tour through certain things,
Right.
like
Yes.
different types of suffering that occur.
Right.
And so like, what are those? Can you give me some examples of a few of those different types of things that would be in a rosary? What are things that you will pray through? Because I think the idea of guided prayer is, I don't think it's terribly unfamiliar to Protestants. If we think about like the formal prayers that we might have, like at Christmas, or maybe if you're in a more liturgical tradition, there will be prayers that everybody reads together, or a creed that everybody reads together, where it's preset. So that's sort of familiar to us. What you're saying is it's more like an outline.
Right.
Like, here are the main points that you want to hit as you pray on this topic. Is that sort of what you're saying?
It's yes. I could normally, if I'm praying the Hail Marys, I'm not normally. It's almost like automatic at this point. So normally my mind is either contemplating the mystery, and I'm sort of placing myself in that mystery. The like in the agony in the garden, I'm like, what is it like to sort of be in agony in the garden and be there, knowing that you're about the cup you're about to drink. So to use the Christ's language. Mm-hmm. I find the rosary to be pretty fruitful. I don't always pray the rosary. Some people do it all the time. There are some communities that go through all 3 sets of mysteries in a day. It's like 15 decades. It's a long time to pray the rosary. And then over time, there's been lots of prayers that are sort of tacked onto it. It's almost like, I mean, you used to working out about like the fruitful benefits of working out consistently most days. The rosary is kind of like that. I look at it like that. It's like a spiritual exercise, literally.
I can absolutely see how that would help with Exodus 90, because like, besides, the physical benefits to something like that, it's like, that's the discipline required for that, to make yourself go do something whether you want to or not, and to stick with something that's difficult. That's invaluable for all parts of life. And that just seems like a basic adult skill, is to have discipline, whether it's through working out or something else. And that's something we all need.
Right. And that's amazing. Like, you'll have like old priests that are fat go on this thing and they'll lose like 80 pounds or something because they're like severely obese, and they'll read like 20 books because they don't know what else to do with their time at this point. And it's like it can be very transformative for a lot of people. The other question I'd say is a part of Exodus, actually, and this is, I'd say, the thing I've been encountering more towards the end, because you get really tired of taking freezing cold showers, is
this sounds awful to me.
Yeah, it is. It sucks. There's no way around it. Like, some people, some guys are like, I love taking cold showers. I'm like, what's wrong with you? Are you psychopath?
I like my hot showers.
Who's that? Is that Norwegian guy, or I don't know, Scandinavian dude? It's like Wilhelm, and he's like, nah, I love to. It's like good for my joints and stuff. No, that's not why you do it. There's a question, a deep embedded question of whether or not you can give suffering to God. Yeah, and there's a different question of whether or not you can sort of engage with almost not negative, but willful suffering for God. And I don't know if that's a topic that I want to go into too much right now, but that is part of it. The rosary is interesting. It's got a really long history. And it's interesting if you go through a lot of the prayers of it. So the way the rosary structure is, you actually start with the Apostles' Creed. And then you go through, again, Our Father and the Hail Marys, and you're just kind of getting into it. And then you end up sort of setting the stage with what the intention of the rosary is. Like, if you're praying for someone or for a specific cause. Like, I know that it's interesting. I know that the popes actually call on some of the more cloistered orders when they have something they really need to pray about. Like, I'm pretty sure when, like, I don't know, when nuclear holocaust was potentially upon us when the Cold War was going on, there were many rosaries said, actually as a in petition to God for the prevention of this potential holocaust.
It makes sense.
You go through 5 decades of it. You can do something called the Divine Chaplet. Was apparently Christ gave one of, I guess, like a seer from the last couple hundred years, a prayer to add to the rosary, actually. I believe that's what the Divine Chaplet's about. And it's where you finish a decade of the rosary, and there's the Divine Chaplet prayer. And then you kind of move on to the next decade of the rosary. And then at the end of the rosary...
No, go finish. I have a question in a second. Go ahead.
And then normally at the end of the Rosary, there's there's a prayer called the Hail Holy Queen, which is essentially pray for us, Mary, and literally show us the fruit of your womb, Jesus Christ, that we might may be worthy of the promises of Christ. And then the prayer ends.
So what do you mean when you say the decades of the Rosary?
So the decade is 10 Hail Marys. And
Okay.
so it's 5 decades. And so what you do is literally the structure is Apostles' Creed, Our Father, 3 Hail Marys. Intention of the Rosary, you introduce the first mystery of the Rosary, then you do an Our Father, 10 Hail Marys. Then you introduce the next mystery of the Rosary, Our Father, 10 Hail Marys, and so on and so forth until you get to the end of the 5th decade. And there's like a set of 5 sorrowful mysteries, there's a set of 5 joyful mysteries, there's a set of 5 glorious mysteries, which starts with the resurrection of Christ. And then there's Pope Francis introduced something new called the Luminous Mysteries, which I don't normally know much about. They're not as they're newer, so people just haven't really had time to, I'd say, flesh them out quite as much. I would say the glorious mysteries are interesting because it's like you have the resurrection of Christ, then you have like the coming of the Holy Spirit in terms of the tongues of fire, and it actually ends with, and this is the one that's going to cause all kinds of chagrin, the coronation of Mary as Queen.
All the Protestants just exploded.
Yeah, pretty much.
Could you explain what that means and why, and why Mary is a thing?
So I'm trying to. So it's interesting in terms of asking why Mary is a thing, because I think about it like Mary was always a thing, I guess. It's one of those like weird questions. I'd say that it's one of those things that's not as sort of explicitly as biblically shown as, let's say, the presence of Christ in the Gospels, because that's what they're all about. But I think it's been a tradition carried on since the early church. That's my understanding of it, because it carries back a long way. And in the sort of Jewish traditions, the queen of the kingdom was actually the mother of the king.
So it's a Jewish idea you're basing that on?
Yes. And it's sort of been continuous of like the analogy of like Mary being the new Eve, and sort of being kind of like if Adam was like, I don't know, the fall of man is like, and then Christ was like the redemption of man. It's like Mary, like the redemption of women. There's lots of like kind of analogies built in there that you're allowed to confuse as much as you want, I guess.
Yeah. We had one conversation on this, and I think we both realized that we needed to read some more before we came back.
There's a book. Yeah, we do. There's a book that my super Marian friends have recommended to me, which I need to read.
We'll do in-depth Mary discussion.
We'll do so. I'm going to read that book first, though.
Yeah.
Scott Hahn also got really into, I guess it's called Mariology. Yeah, it's interesting that I will note that the only 2 times so technically, that everyone gets mad at like the whole papal infallibility thing. Interestingly, that's only ever been used twice. Once in like the mid 1800s, and the next time was like the mid 1900s, and they were both to do with doctrines on Mary. And one was to do with the Immaculate Conception, and the other was to do with the Assumption. Yeah. I need to check on that second one though. But it's only ever been used twice. It wasn't even a doctrinal thing until like the 1800s though, which is interesting.
So switching gears from the Mary thing, what are some other things about Catholicism that Protestants either don't understand or we need to, or you can explain to us a little bit better?
Other things about Catholicism, I'd say the sacramental nature of Catholicism versus, I guess, the way I perceive Protestantism.
Okay.
It's kind of like you go to a Protestant church, and I think it becomes very sermon centric and very teaching centric as a result of that. That's actually not what the Mass is about in a Catholic church, which I think fundamentally changes the nature of a gathering, even though like you still have to do, social things and preach, and like you still have to have a cohesive community. But the primary intent of the Mass is actually the Eucharist. Which is I think is a radical shift. Like if you ever go to a Mass, and it's one long prayer actually, and if you really study the structure of the Mass, it's based on the Book of Revelation, essentially. As well as parts of the Last Supper. And you go through the Mass, and it's broken up into two chunks. One is the liturgy of the Word, where you will have readings from the Old Testament, a psalm, a reading from the New Testament that's not the gospel, and then a gospel reading. And normally what happens is there's kind of this thing where the New Testament is sort of hidden in the Old, and the Old Testament is sort of, let's say, brought forward through the New Testament. And then you have the gospel. And what they do is the priest will then, if it's a good priest, will, I'm going to say, preach a homily in regards to those things. And then that will sort of conclude the liturgy of the Word. Then you'll have the liturgy of the Eucharist, where you witness what's called a consecration, or I'm going to say bread and wine will be brought forward, and the priest will consecrate them, and they will become the body and blood of Christ. And then you receive communion, you receive the Eucharist. It's kind of an interesting thing right now where, depending on what church you go to, most people receive it in the hand. And it was actually pre-Vatican II, which was, I mentioned Vatican II several times. Vatican II changed a lot of things in Catholicism. Essentially, it was an attempt to modernize certain parts of it. Before
Vatican II is, for everybody watching?
Vatican II is an ecumenical council, where a meeting of all the bishops in the entire world, they get together and they discuss the state of the church and make changes to the structure of the church.
When was Vatican I?
Vatican I was in the mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s.
Okay. Sorry, carry on. Just definitional thing that make sure everybody's on the same page.
That's okay. They don't happen that often. They're pretty rare.
I mean, there's two. So.
Yeah. But granted, it's like, was the Vatican really a thing before that? It's like, when did the Vatican come about? It's a different thing because you have the papal states and stuff. But anyways, where was I? Pre-Vatican II, you could actually only receive the Eucharist on your knees and on the tongue. So you kneel down at the altar, and the communion, the Eucharist would be placed directly on your tongue, in terms of you weren't even allowed to touch it. And so it was like you were literally being fed. I've actually been told that some of the Eastern Orthodox use a spoon to like put it in your mouth, which, granted, it's one of those things you're not real comfortable with, but I think that's the way they do it. And it's sort of, it's almost out of a reverence, both of you sort of becoming like a child again, of being fed the body and blood of Christ, as opposed to you sort of receiving it and putting it in your mouth, which that's what I do, because I'm not comfortable necessarily with people putting,
Yeah, it is a little weird, though. I guess the symbolism does make sense that it's something you receive rather than something you take.
Yes. And it was one of those things that even pre-Vatican II, if you go to a Mass, there's the altar at the front, and the priest faces you, the congregation, from the altar. Pre-Vatican II, actually, though, the priest did not face you. The priest was on the same side of the altar, and it was like you were all facing the front, like you were all facing Christ at the same time. And so there's like little changes like that take place over time, and I think they reversed it so that you could actually see what was going on the altar. So I'd say that's one of the radical difference, though, is we really don't look at the Eucharist as a symbol. We look at it as the real thing, in so much as, no, we're not literally eating, bloody flesh, even though that's almost like the spiritual intent of it. This is one of the main big doctrinal differences between Catholicism and Protestantism that comes up in almost every discussion, as well as like the papal thing. But the Eucharist, honestly, the Eucharist is probably the biggest one. And that's why we don't let non-Catholics and Catholics that are not, I'm going to say, in communion with the church receive communion at all. Because I'm going to say you have to have agreed, this is what we believe. I'm going to believe in this, I'm going to engage with this, and I'm going to receive the Eucharist. And you're also not supposed to receive the Eucharist, and if you're in I'm going to say, extreme state of sin. We talked about this actually yesterday, where when you do that, you damn yourself. And you brought up the Bible verse.
1 Corinthians 11, it talks about that.
Yeah. So, and this was kind of the important thing, and it's been interesting if you study the history of the Eucharist, it's fascinating. because you'll have people actually take this almost like mechanical thing of like, thou shalt not receive this unworthily, and they'll try to do it. And there's like some weirdly miraculous happening of people like just being prevented from doing this. Or I'll read a story of someone trying to like ransack a church and the priest like quickly consuming the Eucharist so they cannot defile the Eucharist. Because you'll have people every once in a while try to break into a church, break into the tabernacle to take the church or take the Eucharist and do something with it, like nail it to a tree and pee on it, or do some other weird satanic things to it. That happens every once in a while. Actually, there was a case. This is crazy. There was a case of a church in New Orleans where apparently a man, I don't know, maybe a priest, had like sex with someone on the altar of the church, and beyond being defrocked and like essentially excommunicated from the church, the priest had the altar burned. And it wasn't
Old Testament prophet kind of stuff there.
Yeah, and it wasn't because it was like, ooh, great. It's like, no, you've defiled the house of God. Take this seriously, man. We're getting rid of the altar. And that was I respected him for that. I was like, hell yeah, like take it seriously. Like that's exactly what needs to happen. So, anyways, after the Eucharist, then the Mass ends. And it's interesting because like Mass is kind of close to the word, like it's like, what is it? It's like close to the word. It's like a Latin kind of root. I think, and it's close to.
I mean, everything's Latin with you guys. So
yeah,
of course
it's missa, and it has to do with like mission or to be sent. So you go to the Mass to be sent out, as a thing. And so like the end of the Mass is like, sometimes we'll say, if the Mass never ends, go forth and like, preach the gospel to the world. So that's what happened. And then Roman Catholics are so good at it, they come and get the Eucharist and then don't say hi to anybody and then leave like great Catholics, which is not what you're supposed to do. I think I see that changing. It's one of those things where like I see Catholics leaving, but it's kind of like the Catholics leaving are just, they're just not engaged with it in the first place. And it's one of those questions that like, what do you really want? Like you need to decide this is for you. And the other thing about the Eucharist, which is interesting, you have to be engaged with it, but you also have to be willing to accept the mundanity of it. Like living a life out like faithfully day to day can be kind of mundane. That's part of it. Like things just don't change that much from day to day. And like the other thing about being human is you can get used to anything. And so you're sort of being, I'm going to say, use St. Paul's words, run the race, so to speak.
Right. I'm thinking again about the question that we talked about earlier about why Catholics and Protestants leaving the faith. It sounds like, from what you're describing, like what a Mass is like, that a person engaging with what is going on in a Catholic church is engaging with more of a process. Like the idea is that you are engaging with this thing that is there, like partaking of the sacraments and doing this thing, and like this is how life is supposed to go. And so engaging with it is actually engaging your life into this process or way about doing things. Whereas Protestantism seems more like it's more like things are flipped the other way around, where it's not, there's this thing over here and you can come be a part of this thing. It's more of like, you come be a part of this thing and this thing is supposed to, I was going to say change you. I mean, you would say the same thing as a Catholic, but it's like, it's the focus is the other way around. It's being brought to you rather than you being brought to it, if that makes sense. Mm. And so if you're expecting something to be delivered, given, done with or to you when you go to a Protestant church, then if the person there who's delivering it's not any good, then you're going to be like, well, forget this. Like, I'm out of here. And so I wonder if the sacramental nature of Catholicism changes that.
Potentially.
And it's causing a different reaction.
I think it's a different avenue of intensity that honestly the Catholics have access to. Because it's kind of like we have the sacramental nature of things, but then the rest of the church is, I'm going to engage with it intellectually at a very deep level. I'm going to go on retreats. I'm going to spend time in small groups with many other Catholics, and live out my life in like a faith-like manner or a faithful manner. Mm-hmm. I will say and this comes from an interesting place. Yeah, I am sad that the Protestant world doesn't necessarily have access to that part as much. I do think something has been lost in that. In kind of the more mystical aspects of the church.
Yeah, I agree, and there's a lot of areas in which that is manifested, which is why I'm reading about initiation rites and things like the process of going from childhood to adulthood and things like that. Like, as just a society, and that's not a Catholic Protestant thing, that's just the modern world, the modern Western world. We've walked away from that, and I think we're missing something. I mean, I don't think we necessarily all need to go kill a boar.
I do think
whatever it is.
I think we've maybe gotten a little too utilitarian with things sometimes. Like, what's in it for me, or how do I calculate the value of a thing, or what's practical. And I think as a result, we've, I don't know, left out the soul of a thing.
Yeah, and it's always about, and if you do that too much, then everything becomes a means to an end. It becomes a tool, and yeah, you definitely do lose.
To what end? That's the hard part. Like, I don't know, and maybe the sacramental nature is not necessarily. I mean, like, it's not really a tool to an end. Does it feel like? It's there as like an avenue of grace for you. There's this old Irish priest at so one of those, I'll tell you this fun story. One of the sacraments is called the anointing of the sick, and there's only 7 sacraments in the church, and this is a special thing to be considered a sacrament. And the anointing of the sick is normally, if you think you might die, you normally receive the sacrament. So before major surgery, or there was a wonderful moment where, so my spiritual mentor, Father Ed, he was about to go into like a major surgery because he's an old man. He's 75. And I was remembering the full story the other day. I'd call him to just talk to him sometimes, because I'm a spiritual mentor. And he invited me to come see him in the hospital because he was in the hospital board because he's in the hospital. So I go there, and around the same time, a priest shows up, and he's there to give Father Ed anointing of the sick. It turns out Father Ed had actually baptized this person as a baby. And this guy had eventually become a priest. And it's honestly, I was talking to the priest, and he's like, it really intimidated him to be giving the person that baptized him and, confirmed him as a Catholic, and probably was the reason he became a priest, to be giving him anointing of the sick. Yeah, and that was a beautiful moment. I was very, very glad I was there that night.
Sort of like that Italian priest getting asked to hear the Pope's confession.
Yeah, and those are the moments that almost like, I'd say, reaffirm what I'm doing. If that makes sense, like being able to sort of participate in this. But anyways, the old Irish priest that I go to confession to sometimes, up in Northeast Atlanta. I'll go to confession to him, and for some reason he's very anointing of the sick happy, and he's like, "You sound like you need anointing of the sick," and I'm like, "Okay, sure, why not? I'm not going to refuse a sacrament." But like, you sure this is appropriate? I've watched that guy. He condemned a guy to hell in his homily because the guy hit his dog with his truck. I was like, you can't do that, Father. We're all concerned after church about what happened to your dog, because that's all we got out of the homily that night was, we're concerned about dog. Yeah, he's a great priest. He's one of those priests that I'm not sure, to be honest, I'll ever. I'm not expecting any heavy hitting intellectual takeaways from his preaching, but it's a little different when you experience like a witness that feels like it's coming from a very sincere place. I remember when I was I used to go to the Basilica, which is downtown in Midtown, and there used to be a Polish priest there named Father Adam. Everyone loved Father Adam. And he had this interesting, his story about how he became a priest was really fascinating, actually. Where when he was younger, someone actually brutally murdered his brother and decapitated him, like brutal story. And he's telling this in the homily. And he said the thing that really ultimately got him was he simply could not forgive the guy that did it and was eating him up. But the thing that kind of changed him was he watched his mother forgive the guy. And I think that's ultimately what started him down the road to becoming a priest, and probably is ultimately going to become part of his salvation. I guess it's sort of like being a part of that witness of seeing someone else live out their faith in such an extreme, difficult place. So, you still there, Matt? Oh no, sounds like Matt has dropped out. Well, I guess it just means it gets to be me and you now. Whoever's online, I have no idea who's on.
No,
there we go.
Like I could hear you the whole time. It's like it just cut my
cut everything
audio out. So I'm like click, and it just decided to come back just now. Yeah, I'm gonna sort this camera issue out. I tried
convert now. No,
I tried something different this week and it didn't work, and so yeah, I'll get it figured out eventually. Thank you out there in TV land for being patient, and I'm not really the one you want to see anyway. It's the guests. So as long as you can see the guests, then we're good.
There we go.
So I've got a slightly less obnoxious way of dealing with it this time. I just remove myself from the thing and I get up and fix it and come back. And
okay.
Technical things are not my, I hate dealing with all this sort of stuff. I just,
I don't think I've ever done anything online like this without there being at least one issue. Like every time I teach online, nope, someone's audio doesn't work, they can't hear me, or my camera's broken, or I don't know, or the internet's bad for half the class.
I guess the positive thing about this being after a while after COVID has started is everybody's sort of used to that now, because we've all been doing this online stuff. It's, oh yeah, well somebody's camera dropped out, it happens, whatever. And so yeah, we're there.
And hopefully they've actually sorted out more of the issues now. I mean, now that Microsoft's listening to everything we say and training their AI to be a perfect dictation machine.
Yeah, then you've seen how the pictures are getting animated now?
Yep.
Yeah, that's a little weird. But
so I guess I don't know, I'll go back to the original premise of either people leaving the church from engagement. That's a difficult thing. I do think the hard part of the Protestant world is the kind of fracturing of things. Actually, my mentor did have a nightmare recently where he imagined the church in schism. I think he's actually pretty worried about the German bishops just trying to go off and do their own thing, because they disagree with a large chunk of the church.
Well, they do that, but it usually means they're moving into Poland.
Interesting, fascinating thing about the German church. I have no idea if this is the way. I'm betting this is the way it works with the German Protestant churches. But if you say you're Catholic in Germany, instead of tithing yourself on whether or not you choose to give money to the church or not, the government takes money from you and gives it to the church. It's automatic. And so that's set up a strange situation where the German churches are actually fairly wealthy, but it's because everyone just checks "I'm Catholic" box on the German census or something like that.
And then the German government just takes it.
Yeah, but I don't think I'm betting as many people that check that box in Germany. If it's anything like the U.S., I need to like moving into this box. If it's anything like the U.S., not as many people that claim to be Catholic on a survey also go to church. And so I'm imagining they're just fairly wealthy right now. They also kind of want to do their own thing. I mean, there's a lot of consternation in the church about what to do with, I would say, people that are divorced, women priests, gay people, gay marriage, like anything to do with human sexuality, really, because that's just the giant linchpin of today's cultural conversation.
It is, and we've talked about that, and that's going to be a topic of conversation for everybody for a long time going forward. And and this gets into sort of the where I think theology is going, where it needs to go, is because not all of the questions have been answered. So in one sense, even you could say, well, to live a good life and stuff, you just follow the things that people have done before you, whatever, that's all you need, and so forth. And in a lot of ways that's true, but in a lot of other ways, it's like, well, we've never really answered questions like, what does it mean to be a man, or what does it mean to be a woman? Or even if you can define it in a very basic sense, even if your point of view is it's based on what your biological sex is, and that's it. Even if that's your view, there's still further questions of what does it mean to be a mature man versus what does it mean to be a mature woman? And there's not that much in the Bible on that. There's It's very, very little.
It was probably so self-understood for such a long time.
But how much of that is determined based on the culture that you lived in?
Well, it's probably based on survival.
Yeah.
Like, you're not really concerned about what it means to be a man if you're worried about dying.
So here's two situations. Like, think about it. You're an architect.
Yep.
What does architecture look like? In the first situation where you're worried about survival, and what does architecture look like when you have loads of free time, loads of money, and you have next to no limits?
It gets real abstract.
It gets abstract. You have to start thinking through the question of, what is this building supposed to be in the first place? What is a home? What is like, in the survival sense, it's like, I'm going to pull together anything that I can find that will keep the weather out and keep my family warm and dry and safe. And that's a home. But when you don't have so much questions about money or time, resources, then, as we talked about, you're asking questions like, how does a home contribute or take away from building community amongst the family members? Like, are there common areas, or have you removed all the like that sort of stuff? And I don't think we've ever really thought through that sort of a question, like with male and female. Like, we have a lot better ideas in adult and child, or there's more stuff there, but the sideways thing, not as much.
Well, I think it's probably going to be hard to answer those things with any degree of certitude. It's not that you shouldn't seek certitude, to be honest. Like, I think you should definitely seek it, but I think most of the time you're going to end up making many decisions without having that, including what it means to be male or female. Like, the thing is, we're in the middle of our lives, men, living as men, yet struggling to bring that, experience to prose.
Well, there's certainty, and then there's the complete lack of, like, I have no idea. This feels right, and I want to do better than this feels right. So maybe it's like, well, here's a good model that I can follow.
How do you define manhood biblically?
I don't have an answer to that question yet. I'm trying to think.
Well, you could probably have some guesses. Like, you could sit there and be like, I bet fatherhood is going to, in some way, be part of answering the question of manhood.
Yeah, it seems to be part of it.
And I'm betting motherhood's going to be part of the question of what it means to talk about womanhood.
In a general sense for both groups.
Right.
Because
I don't think you can answer it super specifically. No, but you can't. I don't think you're going to be able to answer it super specifically. Like, this is going to be a highly, almost poetic definition.
And that may be the answer. Because then you have a question about what about a couple who can't have kids? And so it's like, well, they can't. Are they not a man and woman anymore? It's like, what?
But then there's the question of, what does it really mean to be a father? Is it biological? Or is it kind of I'd say the focus of the how you pay attention to things in a fatherly way as opposed to a motherly way? I don't know. Like, those are the kinds of questions I would end up asking.
And that's another way to go with it. There's the very, very, there's a physical dimension of things, like it's this and this and this, which is basically, if you look at the way the most of the world is operated for most of the time, it's kind of like that. And then there's the more abstract sort of way, and maybe there's others beyond that. Like, I don't know. Like, I've just begun to start really thinking through those things.
You should study Mary.
Years. Okay.
I can almost. This is so. I'm gonna read this book, and then we're having this discussion, because I have this, like.
Can you give me her number?
I'll hand you a rosary.
Yeah, not what I'm looking for, but.
Sorry, that was just too perfect. No, it's just this thing when we talk about. I don't know. Well, like, it's Roman Catholic world. I'm going to say the answer is not necessarily less easy, or easier than the one you're searching for. But, like, if I think about, like, Adam and Eve, and then, like, the new Adam and the new Eve, that just, I don't know. That would just be where I start, I think. I'm going to go read this book. We're talking about it.
Read your book on Mary. We'll have more Mary discussions, and this will continue.
I need to go look at the theology of the body. That was JP2's big thing. Because, like, so there was a document in the history of, I'd say, artificial contraception. And I think one of the biggest reasons we actually have these great consternations about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman today is actually because of contraception. Because it's forced us to sort of change our lives in interesting ways, because the communities have, I'd say, restructured to cater to contraception in terms of what's expected at what time in life and how people have kids and families and how communities deal with, I'd say, fewer kids and fewer families in sort of childless communities. Which is all a thing now, and it really used to not be a thing. And it also didn't necessarily, not force couples, but like part of the point of marriage is for the springtime of your love to die, kind of like to the summer of having children. And there was a document that JP2, I guess it was JP2, it was either JP2 or the one right before him. It's called Humani Vitae, and it's a papal document describing the church's teaching on human sexuality, mostly in response to, I'd say, both abortion and artificial contraception. And in this, the church sort of laid out its complete rejection of any form of, I'd say, technological or chemical or barrier types of contraception. If you're Roman Catholic, pretty much the only way you can contracept is through a natural means called NFP. Which is, I'd say, it still is highly medically relevant, where you essentially are monitoring, I'd say, your own temperatures and trying to do this, because the goal of this was to end up respecting human sexuality. And I think that's tied up into this, is what does it mean to actually respect human sexuality, as opposed to opening the door for the abuse of human sexuality. Now, that's very biblical. It's interesting if you study the abuses of human sexuality in the Bible. For example, Lot's daughters getting him drunk and committing incestuous acts with him, and thus two different peoples that ended up being the enemies of the Israelites were born as a result.
Interesting how that sort of stuff happens in Genesis.
Yeah, or Abraham, producing Ishmael, and that producing a whole other thing. Or I'd say David, cheating on with Bathsheba, and that becoming a problem. Like, it's interesting, like. Actually, I need to give you that Bishop Barron book on A Letter to a Suffering Church, because he ends up just listing example after example after example of abuses of human sexuality in the Bible and the deleterious results of that.
Almost like that, you reap what you sow.
Yeah, literally.
Where did I hear that?
Quite literally.
Exactly.
And I think that, interestingly, I think the artificial contraception has actually made those sins more subtle, to be honest. Because the results are almost like, is there still, like, it's kind of like if Lot had incestuous relations with his daughters, but that not actually produced heirs, would that have been any less damaging for their souls? Like, was the wrong thing producing an heir, or was the wrong thing the act in of itself? It's a fundamental question, because today people seem to think that because the act doesn't necessarily do anything, does not necessarily lessen the damage on their souls.
No, and I think that's something that we've missed in a lot of areas. And ironically, I think things like that have actually brought that to our attention, that it's not just about the physical consequences, because when you can avoid them, there's still other things that are there too. Like, what happens like to people who just have wild amounts of sex all the time with all sorts of whoever and whatever? They end up destroying their ability to connect with other humans, and they really damage themselves in a way to connect, especially with another person. And so
it's like they just maybe destroy their ability for intimacy. And that's one of the things. It's interesting because we can say that. I can almost see the arguments back, like, no, that's not necessarily true. I'm like, you're right. There's always an exception to a rule somehow, but that's an individual path that requires individual examination.
It's like, we'll say, well, I never really thought about it like that, and so it's all just sort of casual to me. But like, that in itself is its own problem.
I'm amazed people are able to play with it like that. Like, you're playing with something that literally produces other human beings. Granted, everybody want to be banging all the time, but they do. And that's kind of hard to deal with. Like, people today seem to not to do what to do with temptation. Like, the answer isn't to just give in. People are okay with giving in to certain temptations. Maybe unless it makes you real fat. Maybe people aren't okay with that.
I would argue there's a lot of people who don't know what temptation is because they haven't fought their
That's
desires
true,
long
too.
enough to know what that is.
What does it mean to be tempted? Everyone needs to have a good lit class in school. That'll explain it to you. You'll be introduced into the world of thought.
Yeah, I don't know. Growing up, school was just read a whole bunch of Shakespeare, which nobody ever read, and that we never discussed. You just read a bunch of book reports, and
we had people that truly. I had teachers that would truly challenge me on what I thought about the books we read.
Which sounds amazing.
I had some good teachers. As a result, now granted, there were some teachers I was like, nah, you can check out. I don't care. But like I said, I probably need to write a letter to that guy. My junior year literature teacher was the one that helped, I'd say, awaken me to the moral imperative of the universe. That's what I call it, anyways.
What do you mean by moral imperative of the universe?
It's like things actually matter. I have a very hard time explaining it other than that. It's like it wasn't there, and then things just mattered, and they've always mattered since then. And it's never left me. It's almost like a compulsion that like I can't ignore this. The awakening of some sort of consciousness.
Yeah, we could use more of that.
And the interesting thing is, I don't know. When I teach my own students, I try to sort of, I don't know, help show them that a little bit. Because when I was in college, I experienced a similar thing with architecture. That I had a professor that was so profoundly passionate and so it's so reactive to certain things visually that it almost like kind of startled me. I'm like, why is he reacting like this to an aesthetic? And I would spend the rest of my college career trying to figure it out. And then developing my own taste in aesthetics as a result of that, which goes on to influence what I do today. Although, funny enough, it's interesting because like we'd have debates about truth or something in architecture, and our professor is just like, yeah, you're not going to find much of that here. And we're like, that's a lie. I can find it. No, he was right.
No truth in architecture?
It just doesn't help to think about it like that. There's a lot of beauty in architecture.
Okay.
Truth is not, it's just not the same thing.
Not the right category.
No, that's probably the issue. It's just categorically different. There are definitely things that are not beautiful that I see in architecture. And that comes from like, I'd say part of the hard part about architecture is it's in front of everybody all the time. Like great architecture and bad architecture, however you define it, it's in front of everyone all of the time. And it's like if Shakespeare was in front of you when you were like 5 years old, you'd probably think it was stupid, right? Like it's kind of like I don't know. Think about any. You probably thought the Bible was stupid when you were 5 years old, maybe. Like if you tried to read the Bible.
I don't know that I even thought about it at that point. I don't think I did. Maybe I did.
You're around it, but like at that point, maybe you're 12. Maybe you just think it's stupid because you're 12. Like it's stuff like that. And so it's interesting with architecture because, like, how do you learn about architecture the same way you would spend trying to understand great works of literature, right? But you're used to seeing this stuff all of the time. And there's definitely some buildings, some pieces of architecture you can go and see that you've never been around before, and you might think they're amazing. But that's a hard thing to do.
If you're basing if your improvement is based on exposure to something new, then it progressively gets more and more difficult.
Yep.
If your improvement is based on something like a skill that you can master, then that's easier. But if it's not that, then, I mean, I'm not an architect, but it does seem a bit fuzzy because it's not like there's a clear target to aim at.
Yeah, well, it's in literature, the target's not as clear either, I would say. It's a cultivated target.
I mean, if you pick something that's a little more rigid, like say something like chess, it's like, well, there's some very, very clear things that you can do. You can learn, the Sicilian defense, and you can learn how to, or to use you can learn the Queen's Gambit. And
the measure of that is you beat everybody.
Yeah, you beat everybody, but you learn all the different lines that everybody else has done. You learn how to respond to this line and that line and so forth. And there's that. So, I mean, at some point you step out from just memorizing stuff and actually playing, and it can become more of an art. but they're very clear paths forward. It seems like in other things like literature, architecture, maybe the paths are a little fuzzier.
No, they're not nearly as clear. Because the rubric, the game, the game is simply not set up like that. Of like, here's like a set of clear goals. It'd be kind of like playing chess and arguing who's got the best style of play.
Like, who wins?
Yeah, like it's because it's like but the
There's
best
a yes no at the end.
Because like the best architecture is kind of like there are some pieces of architecture that are clearly no from like a functional standpoint. If we look at it like that in terms of playing the game on a functional, like you can be the best chess champion but be a total jackass. But like, what's the most beautiful architecture is a different question. If that's the end goal.
How do you define beauty? Another topic.
Yep, different topic. That's a different time. I'm honestly tired of trying to define it. I'd rather make something beautiful.
Yeah.
Which it's interesting how you can kind of do that maybe, but you can't necessarily define it.
I know it when I see it.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out what other ground we want to cover today.
Is there anything else you want to talk about, or we can just stop here and take any questions if anybody has any, and then we can do it again if you want to talk about something else another time.
Let's do questions.
Okay.
It's been a couple hours.
I'm gonna throw one up here. We got one or two in the chat already. If anybody's watching this and has any questions, type them out, and then we'll get to those. So let's see here. So the people who leave the Catholic Church, do they become non-believers, or do they just go on to do other things? Like, do they be Protestants? Do they become Buddhists? Do they become New Age spiritualists? Just ignore everything in general, and still be somewhat spiritual, or do they become atheists? Like, where do they go?
I've seen people become hardcore atheists. That's happened in high school a couple times. I've seen people most commonly people just kind of drift into nothing. They might still check Catholic on the box, but they haven't been to church in years, and they just stop engaging totally because they find that they can sort of live life without it. They can survive without it. They can, I don't know, chase other things. I don't know, marriage, family, money, success in business, anything like that, or success at college. That was the thing that I saw. Or they find that there's other things that they just want to do. Like I had some friends that were gay in college that were like really, really into their Catholic faith in college, and then they eventually left because they just, like a guy wanted to go marry a guy, and you can't do that if you're Catholic. And so I think the thing that I saw was just really a drift. It was just a drift away from it. Most rarely people would have like an explosive leaving. That almost never happened. It was really just more of a gradual thing. Yeah, maybe like one person would become Protestant. That didn't happen that often. Like I don't know if I know anyone in my personal life that's done that. Yeah.
What about the other side of things? What about people coming to the church? People who come into Catholic Church, do they have a common thread? Is there anything? Is it pretty much just you're born into it, or are there people converting to Catholicism? And if so, like what sorts of people do that?
No, there's actually quite a few people that convert to Catholicism. The process of that is you go through something called RCIA, which is called Rite of Christian Initiation. And in America, I guess. And so like I sponsored someone into the church a couple years ago that his way into the church was actually reading a lot of Thomas Aquinas, actually. And he'd gone through college. He was kind of an agnostic atheist philosophy major. He ended up becoming Buddhist for a little while, and then he ultimately decided to become Catholic from the study of Thomas Aquinas. That's happened. There's a guy in my fraternity right now. He's a really recent convert. He became Catholic over the summer. He also entered the church through kind of the intellectual component. I think he was more of his historian kind of guy. He is a theology nerd. Oh my gosh. He is super. It's crazy because he's been Catholic for less than a year, and you could ask him about some of this stuff and he'll be able to rattle off like a million times more information than I can. Like it's like all he studies. Like he's super into it. And he experienced an extreme conversion from, I would say, being kind of Christian growing up, being a hardcore atheist, then becoming a Lutheran, and then becoming Catholic. All in like the span of like 3 years.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot. And he's actually, right now he says he's discerning priesthood. But they actually won't let you enter a seminary to become a priest until you've been a convert for at least 2 years, which sounds wise.
Good. Yeah.
There were other people that became Catholic in college. I think sometimes that would happen because they were just part of that Catholic group and they would become just Catholic. They come from all walks of life, though. I mean, and the saying is no one enters the church through the same door. So it's always a little different. I would hazard to guess that some people become Catholic because that's where they've experienced most of the joy in their life. That is something I will say uniquely I find, I would say either in the Catholic Church or other Christian circles, is joy. I don't think that secular culture knows what to do with real joy.
I want to ask the question of what is real joy, but that's going to be another like 20 or 30-minute discussion.
It's a long discussion, but like
so let's leave it at that and not go down that additional road. I mean, we're already pushing 2 hours, right? Already.
We are.
So, all right. Well, thank you for talking with me and sharing your thoughts. And thank you everybody who's watching now or will in the future. So. Any closing thoughts or words you want to share with anybody who's going to see this?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, I think the biggest thing that maybe I have to offer is actually to sort of be a proponent of Exodus 90. Because I think especially with the pandemic, people are going to need both an avenue potentially back into the church if they've left. And I think people also need a challenge sometimes.
And that works for Catholics or Protestants.
Yeah.
Cool. Send me something that I can put in the description for people who are going to take a look at that and give them a direction for how to find that easily, and I'll do that.
I can do that.
Alrighty. So thank you again, and to everybody who's watching, have a good day.
See you later.